Jake stood in the kitchen, the morning sun casting long shadows across the floor as he packed Emily's suitcase for her business trip. His hands moved mechanically, folding clothes with precision, but his mind was elsewhere. Emily's voice cut through his thoughts, sharp and slightly irritated. "Jake, are you even listening to me?" she asked, her voice tinged with frustration. He looked up, meeting her eyes. "Sorry, what did you say?" Emily sighed, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "I said, it feels like we barely see each other anymore. You're always working late. It's like you're married to your job." Jake forced a smile, trying to lighten the mood. "I'm just making sure we can afford that anniversary trip you wanted." Emily's expression softened for a moment, but the tension lingered. "I know you're working hard, but I need more from you, Jake. More than just financial security." He nodded, though he wasn't sure he fully understood. They'd had this argument before, and it always left him feeling like he was failing at something he couldn't quite grasp. "I promise. I'll try to be around more. We'll talk about this when you get back, okay?" Emily gave a non-committal nod, and the conversation drifted into silence. Jake watched her finish her coffee, her eyes darting to her phone every few seconds. It buzzed, and she quickly glanced at the screen, a small smile playing on her lips before she slipped the device into her bag. "Who's that?" Jake asked, trying to sound casual. "Just work stuff," Emily replied, her tone dismissive. "You know how it is." He did know, but something about the way she said it made his stomach twist. He brushed it off, chalking it up to his own insecurities. After all, she was going on a business trip, and he trusted her. Or at least he wanted to. As Emily left for the airport, Jake felt a knot of unease settle in his chest. He shook it off, attributing it to the stress of their recent arguments. But as the day wore on, the feeling only grew stronger. Later that evening, Jake sat in their living room, the TV on but his mind elsewhere. He picked up his phone, scrolling through social media absent-mindedly. A notification popped up, a post from Emily. He clicked on it, his heart skipping a beat when he saw a picture of her with a group of colleagues, standing close to a man he didn't recognize. The caption read, "Great first day with the team." He zoomed in, scrutinizing the unfamiliar face. Emily had never mentioned him before. His mind raced, piecing together fragments of conversations they'd had about her work, trying to remember if she'd ever brought up a new colleague. The next few days passed in a blur. Emily's texts were brief, her replies to his calls filled with static excuses about meetings and late dinners. Jake's unease grew with each passing hour. He found himself checking his phone constantly, hoping for a message that would ease his suspicions. One evening, as he sat nursing a beer, his friend Tom called. They chatted about work and life, but then Tom hesitated, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Jake, I don't know how to say this, but I've heard things. About Emily. People are talking about her spending a lot of time with some guy at work." Jake's grip tightened around the bottle. "What do you mean?" "Just keep your eyes open. I don't want to jump to conclusions, but you deserve to know if something's up." Jake thanked Tom, his mind reeling. He hung up, staring at the wall as the pieces clicked into place. Emily's late nights, the texts, the photo. It all pointed to something he didn't want to acknowledge. He spent the rest of the night pacing the house, his thoughts a chaotic mess. The love he felt for Emily was overshadowed by a growing sense of betrayal and anger. He had to know the truth, and he wasn't going to rest until he found it. Emily's business trip was supposed to be a straightforward affair, but as she sat at the hotel bar with Mark, her colleague, things felt anything but simple. The dim lighting and soft music created an intimate atmosphere that was hard to ignore. Mark leaned closer, his eyes locked on hers, and Emily felt a flutter in her chest she hadn't experienced in years. "You know," Mark said, swirling his drink, "I've always admired your work ethic. You're really something, Emily." She laughed, a bit too loudly, trying to brush off the compliment. "Oh, come on, Mark, you're just saying that." "No, really," he insisted, his gaze lingering. "You're incredible." Emily felt her cheeks warm under his attention. It was nice to be noticed, to feel appreciated. Lately with Jake, she felt more like a fixture in the house than a partner. She tried to shake the thought, focusing instead on the conversation. As the night wore on, the drinks flowed, and the lines between professional and personal blurred. Emily found herself leaning into Mark's words, his presence. She knew it was wrong, but the allure of feeling desired was intoxicating. When Mark suggested a nightcap in his room, she hesitated only for a moment before following him upstairs. Back home, Jake sat in their dimly lit living room, his laptop open on the coffee table. He tried to distract himself with work, but his thoughts kept drifting back to Emily. The uneasy feeling had grown into a gnawing certainty that something was off. He opened Emily's social media again, scrolling through her posts. The picture with Mark stood out, and he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it. Driven by a mix of desperation and determination, he started digging. He searched for Mark's profile, combing through photos, comments, anything that might give him a clue. Then he found a photo tagged at the same hotel Emily was staying at, posted by one of her colleagues. There was Emily, standing close to Mark, their smiles wide and easy. Jake's heart sank as he noticed the subtle way her body angled toward Mark, the way their shoulders touched. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. Emily was with Mark, and it wasn't just business. He needed more proof, something undeniable. He reached out to a few mutual friends, casually asking if they'd heard anything about Emily's trip. The responses were vague, but one friend confirmed that Emily and Mark had been seen together frequently, even outside of work hours. Jake's anger simmered beneath the surface, a slow burn that threatened to consume him. He couldn't believe this was happening. Emily, the woman he loved, was betraying him. He felt a mix of rage and heartbreak, but he knew he had to keep it together, at least until he had all the facts. Meanwhile, in the hotel room, Emily found herself caught up in a whirlwind of emotions. She and Mark had shared more than a few drinks, and now they were alone, the air thick with tension. Mark leaned in, his lips brushing against hers, and Emily felt a thrill run through her. It was a moment of weakness, a lapse in judgment, but in that instant she didn't care. The kiss was electric, a spark that ignited something deep within her. But as quickly as it began, reality crashed down around her. She pulled away, guilt flooding her senses. What was she doing? She was married, and this was wrong. "I can't," she whispered, her voice shaky. "I'm sorry, Mark. I shouldn't have let this happen." Mark nodded, his expression understanding but disappointed. "I get it. It's just, there's something between us, Emily. You can't deny that." She shook her head, trying to clear her thoughts. "I need to go. I need to think." Back in her own room, Emily sat on the bed, her mind racing. She felt exhilarated but also deeply ashamed. She loved Jake, didn't she? But things had been so strained between them, and with Mark, everything felt easy, exciting. As the night wore on, she wrestled with her emotions, torn between the thrill of the affair and the guilt of betraying Jake. She knew she had to make a choice, but the decision seemed impossible. Jake, on the other hand, was done waiting. He had enough evidence to confirm his suspicions, and his anger fueled his resolve. He would confront Emily as soon as she returned, and he wouldn't hold back. The betrayal was too deep, the wound too raw. He needed answers, and he needed them now. The day Emily returned home, the air was thick with unspoken tension. Jake paced the living room, his mind a storm of emotions. He heard the familiar sound of Emily's car pulling into the driveway and steeled himself for what was to come. When Emily walked through the door, her face lit up with a smile that quickly faded as she saw Jake's expression. "Hey," she said cautiously, setting her suitcase down. "Hey," Jake replied, his voice cold and clipped. "We need to talk." Emily hesitated, sensing the gravity in his tone. "Okay," she said, trying to sound casual. "What's up?" Jake gestured for her to sit, and as she did, he pulled out his phone, opening the gallery where he had saved the incriminating photos and messages. "I know about Mark," he said, his voice barely above a whisper but filled with a dangerous edge. Emily's eyes widened, her breath catching in her throat. "Jake, Don't," he interrupted, holding up a hand. "Don't lie to me. I have the photos, the messages. I know everything." The room fell silent, the only sound the ticking of the clock on the wall. Emily's mind raced, trying to find the right words, but nothing came. She looked at Jake, seeing the hurt and anger in his eyes, and she felt her defenses crumble. "I'm sorry," she finally said, her voice breaking. "I didn't mean for it to happen. It just did." Jake's expression hardened, his anger boiling over. "You didn't mean for it to happen? You think that's an excuse? You think that makes it okay?" "I was lonely," Emily shot back, her voice rising. "You're never around, you're always working. I needed someone and Mark was there." Jake shook his head, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "So you just decided to throw away everything we have? For what? A fling with some guy you barely know?" Emily's eyes filled with tears, but she refused to back down. It wasn't just a fling. It was more than that. "More than us," Jake's voice was sharp, cutting through the air like a knife. "You're willing to risk everything for him." Emily hesitated, the weight of her actions crashing down on her. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice small. "I'm so confused." Jake let out a harsh laugh, devoid of any humor. "Confused? You're confused? Well, let me make it simple for you. You've destroyed this marriage, Emily. You've destroyed us." Emily flinched at his words, the truth of them hitting her like a physical blow. She opened her mouth to speak, to try and explain, but Jake wasn't finished. "I know about your little financial plans with Mark," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "Did you really think I wouldn't find out? That I wouldn't notice the money disappearing?" Emily's heart sank, her face draining of color. She had hoped to keep that part hidden, to deal with it later, but now it was all out in the open. "Jake, No," he snapped, cutting her off. "You don't get to explain. You don't get to justify this. You've made your choices, Emily, and now you're going to face the consequences." Emily sat in stunned silence, the reality of her situation settling over her like a suffocating blanket. She had known there would be consequences, but she hadn't fully grasped the extent until now. "I never wanted to hurt you," she said weakly, tears streaming down her face. I didn't know how to fix things between us." Jake's anger flared again, his voice rising. "So you thought sleeping with someone else would fix it? You thought betraying me was the answer?" "I was lost," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. "Well, you found your way now," Jake replied coldly. "You can have Mark, you can have your new life. But know this, you've lost me. You've lost everything we built together." Emily's heart shattered at his words, the finality of them leaving her breathless. She had hoped, deep down, that there might be a way back, a way to mend what she had broken, but now she realized that hope was gone. Jake stood, his expression unreadable. "I want you out," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "Pack your things and go. I can't look at you right now." Emily nodded numbly, her mind a whirlwind of regret and despair. She had made her bed, and now she had to lie in it. As she moved to gather her belongings, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had just lost the most important thing in her life. Jake watched Emily leave, the door closing with a finality that echoed through the house. The silence was deafening, but it was a silence he needed. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. The betrayal had cut deep, but now it was time to act. The next morning, Jake sat in his lawyer's office, the sterile environment a stark contrast to the turmoil in his mind. He explained the situation, laying out the evidence of Emily's affair and her financial indiscretions. The lawyer listened, nodding thoughtfully as Jake spoke, and then began outlining the steps they could take to protect Jake's interests. "We'll start by securing your financial assets," the lawyer said, tapping a pen against a notepad. "Given her actions, you have a strong case for limiting her access to your shared accounts." Jake nodded, his resolve hardening. "I want to make sure she can't touch anything. She made her choices, and now she has to live with them." The lawyer assured him they would move quickly, and Jake left the office feeling a sense of grim satisfaction. He was taking control of the situation, ensuring that Emily would face the consequences of her betrayal. Meanwhile, Emily found herself in a whirlwind of chaos. Word of her affair had spread quickly, thanks in part to Jake's decision to share the truth with their friends and family. She felt the sting of judgment in every sideways glance, every whispered conversation that stopped when she entered a room. Her social circle, once vibrant and supportive, had all but vanished overnight. Emily's professional life was no better. Rumors of her indiscretion had reached her workplace, and she faced a tense meeting with her boss. The disappointment in his eyes was palpable as he outlined the company's stance on personal conduct and the potential repercussions for her career. "We can't have this kind of scandal affecting our team, Emily," he said, his tone firm but regretful. "We'll need to conduct a review, and until then, you're on unpaid leave." The words hit Emily like a physical blow, and she nodded numbly, knowing there was little she could say in her defense. She had brought this on herself, and now she had to face the fallout. As she left the office, her phone buzzed with a message from Mark. Her heart sank as she read it, the words confirming what she had feared. Mark, it seemed, was not interested in a relationship complicated by scandal. He was moving on, leaving Emily to deal with the wreckage alone. Jake, on the other hand, was relentless in his pursuit of justice. He methodically informed everyone in their social circle about Emily's actions, ensuring that the truth was known. The reactions were mixed, but the general consensus was clear: Emily had crossed a line, and now she was paying the price. In the days that followed, Jake focused on rebuilding his life. He threw himself into work, finding solace in the routine and the distraction it provided. He met with friends, old and new, who offered support and encouragement. Slowly, he began to feel like himself again, his confidence returning as he realized he was better off without the weight of Emily's betrayal. Emily, meanwhile, struggled to pick up the pieces of her shattered life. She moved into a small apartment, the walls closing in on her as she faced the reality of her situation. Her savings dwindled quickly, and without a steady income, she found herself in a precarious financial position. Desperation gnawed at her, and she reached out to friends, hoping for a lifeline. But the responses were lukewarm at best, and she realized with a sinking heart that she was truly alone. The support system she had taken for granted was gone, and she had no one to blame but herself. Jake discovered through mutual acquaintances that Mark had a history of affairs, a fact that deepened Emily's shame and isolation. It was a bitter twist, but one that reinforced Jake's decision to cut ties completely. He refused to let Emily's mistakes drag him down any further. Despite everything, there was a part of Jake that mourned the loss of what they had shared. But he knew that the person he had loved was gone, replaced by someone he could no longer trust. He channeled his emotions into positive change, focusing on his own growth and happiness. As the weeks passed, Jake found himself moving forward, the anger and hurt slowly giving way to a sense of peace. He had been through the fire and come out stronger on the other side. Emily, however, was left to grapple with the consequences of her choices, her once promising future now a shadow of what it could have been. The fallout from the affair had been devastating, but it had also been a catalyst for change. Jake was determined to make the most of his new beginning, leaving Emily to face the harsh reality of her actions. Jake stood in his lawyer's office once more, signing the final papers that would solidify his financial independence from Emily. The lawyer nodded approvingly, confirming that Jake's assets were now secure, and that Emily would be left with nothing from their shared life. "Thank you," Jake said, his voice firm. He felt a weight lift off his shoulders, knowing he had taken every step to protect himself from further betrayal. As he left the office, Jake felt a strange mix of emotions. There was a sense of closure, but also a lingering sadness for the life he had once envisioned with Emily. He pushed those thoughts aside, focusing on the future he was now free to build on his own terms. Meanwhile, Emily was struggling to navigate her new reality. The loss of her job had hit hard, and she found herself scraping by, taking odd jobs wherever she could find them. Her once vibrant social life had dwindled to near nothing, and she spent her evenings alone, reflecting on the choices that had led her here. One evening, driven by desperation, Emily reached out to Jake. She dialed his number with trembling fingers, unsure if he would even answer. When he picked up, his voice was cold and distant. "Jake, please," Emily began, her voice cracking. "I know I've made mistakes, but I need help. I'm struggling, and I don't know where else to turn." There was a long pause on the other end, and Emily held her breath, hoping for a glimmer of compassion. But when Jake spoke, his words were resolute. "You made your bed, Emily," he said, his tone unyielding. "You chose Mark over us, over everything we had. Now you have to live with that." Emily felt tears sting her eyes, but she forced herself to keep speaking. "I know, and I'm sorry. I've lost everything, Jake. I just need a little help to get back on my feet." Jake's silence was deafening, and when he finally spoke, his voice was softer but no less firm. "I'm sorry you're struggling, Emily. But I can't help you. I've moved on, and you need to do the same." The call ended, leaving Emily staring at her phone, the finality of Jake's words sinking in. She had hoped for a lifeline, but instead she was left to face the consequences of her actions alone. For Jake, the conversation was a turning point. He felt a sense of closure, knowing he had done everything he could to protect himself and move forward. He had no intention of letting Emily's pleas pull him back into the past. In the weeks that followed, Jake focused on rebuilding his life. He reconnected with old friends, threw himself into work, and even began to explore new hobbies. He found solace in the small victories, the moments of joy that reminded him of the life he was creating for himself. Emily, on the other hand, was forced to confront the reality of her situation. She had lost her job, her friends, and her marriage, and now she had to find a way to rebuild from the ground up. It was a daunting task, but she knew she had no other choice. As the days turned into weeks, Emily began to take small steps toward rebuilding her life. She found a new job, one that paid less but offered a chance to start fresh. She reached out to a few friends, hoping to mend broken relationships, and slowly began to piece together a new support system. But despite her efforts, the shadow of her past loomed large. She knew she had made mistakes, and the road to redemption was long and uncertain. She had lost everything, and now she had to find a way to live with the consequences. For Jake, the journey was one of healing and growth. He had faced betrayal and come out stronger, determined to build a life that was true to himself. He knew he deserved better, and he was committed to finding happiness on his own terms. The final confrontation with Emily had been difficult, but it had also been necessary. It had allowed him to close the door on the past and look toward the future with hope and determination. In the end, both Jake and Emily were left to navigate their new realities, forever changed by the choices they had made. Jake found strength in his independence, while Emily faced the daunting task of rebuilding from the ashes of her mistakes. The consequences of betrayal were harsh, but they had also paved the way for new beginnings and the possibility of redemption,